All right, today we're going to talk about 7.4, the legacy of the war. And after the war wrapped up, just kind of what were the costs, why the Americans won, different things like that. Right here on this picture, this is a guy named Joseph Plum Martin. And in 1776, when he was 15 years old, he signed up to fight for the Americans, and he stayed with the Army until the war ended, and he rose in rank from private all the way to sergeant. Among his experiences were the terrible winter at Valley Forge. He was also at Yorktown when the war ended. One of the hardest things Martin faced was leaving the Army after the war was over, and a lot of years later he wrote about that day, and he wrote, and I quote, "There was so much sorrow as joy. We had lived together as a family of brothers for several years, setting aside some little family squabbles like most other families. We had shared with each other the hardships, dangers, and sufferings incident to a soldier's life, had sympathized with each other in trouble and sickness, had assisted in bearing each other's burdens, and now we were to be parted forever." At the war's end, Martin and his country faced a pretty uncertain future. How would the United States recover from the war, and what issues would confront the new nation? So these are some of the things that we're going to talk about today in Section 4. Now, by the end of this section today, you should be able to evaluate the strengths of the American Army in comparison with the British Army. You should tell me the 6 points of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. You should be able to analyze the costs of the Revolution, and you will be able to identify the challenges that the new United States faced after the war. So, moving on. Now, why did the Americans win? Well, in November of 1783, the last British ships and troops left New York City, and American troops marched in. As Washington said goodbye to his officers in a New York tavern, he hugged each one of them with tears running down his face. He became so upset at one point he had to actually leave the room. Earlier in the fall, Washington had written a farewell letter to his armies, and in it, he praised them by saying that their endurance through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle. So by their persistence, the Americans won independence even though they faced many obstacles. As we've talked about in previous sections, they lacked training and experience, they were often short of supplies and weapons, and by contrast, the British forces ranked among the best trained in the world. They were experienced and well-supplied professional soldiers. With all this, though, the Americans still had certain advantages that enabled them to win. First of all, they had better leadership. British generals were overconfident, they made poor decisions, and by contrast, Washington learned from his mistakes. After some early defeats, he developed the strategy of dragging out the war to wear down the British. And despite these difficulties, he never gave up. Foreign aid also helped. Britain's rivals, especially France, helped America. Spain was also helpful, but foreign loans and military aid were extremely key to America winning the Revolutionary War. Knowledge of the land also helped because the Americans knew the land where the war took place, and they used that knowledge very well. The British could control coastal cities, but as we talked about, they couldn't control the interior. And the fourth thing that really helped them was motivation. The Americans simply had more reason to fight. It wasn't the British lives at stake, it was American lives at stake. So they are also fighting for not just their life, but their property and their dream of freedom. Now, as the winners, the Americans won favorable terms in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which effectively ended the Revolutionary War. The treaty included the following 6 conditions. First of all, the United States was independent. Secondly, its boundaries would be the Mississippi River on the west, Canada on the north, and Spanish Florida on the south. Third, the United States would receive the right to fish off Canada's Atlantic coast near Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Number 4, each side would repay debts it owed the other. Number 5, the British would return any enslaved persons they had captured. And 6, Congress would recommend that the states return any property they had seized from loyalists. Now, these are kind of interesting because you look at some of these and they didn't happen. For instance, number 4, they never paid off their pre-war debts. And number 6, Congress only recommended that the states return property. They didn't demand it. So do you think most people are going to return that stuff? I would think not. So neither side lived up to the terms. Like we talked about, they did not repay pre-war debts. They did not return loyalist property. And the British also did not return their runaway slaves, and they refused to give up military outposts in the Great Lakes area. This picture right here on the right is a famous painting by an American painter named Benjamin West. And he started a portrait of the men who negotiated the Treaty of Paris. but the British officials refused to pose, so West never finished the painting. So from left to right, we have American officials John Jay, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and two others that remain nameless. So kind of an interesting painting. Now, as far as cost of the war, we don't really know an exact number of deaths, but 8 years of fighting took a pretty big toll on both sides. An estimated 25,700 Americans died in the war, and 1,400 remained missing, with about 8,200 Americans wounded. Some of them were left with permanent disabilities like amputated limbs, and the British suffered about 10,000 military deaths. Many soldiers did survive the war, but they were left with no money, so they received very little or no pay for their service. So instead of back payment, the government gave some soldiers certificates for land in the West. A lot of men sold that land to get money for food and other basic needs. Both the Congress and the states had borrowed money to finance the conflict, and it left the war with the nation debt of about $27 million, which was a debt that would be very hard for the Americans to pay off. Now, the losers of the war also suffered because thousands of loyalists lost their property. We figure between 60 to 100,000 loyalists left the United States during and after the war. Among them were several thousand African Americans and Native Americans, including Joseph Brant. Most of the loyalists went to Canada. There they settled new towns and provinces, and they also brought English traditions to areas that the French had settled. Even today we have in Canada both French and English as official languages, which is something you learned back in 7th grade. So the American Revolution was not just a war, but it also was a big change in ideas about government. Before the war, Americans had demanded their rights as English citizens, but after declaring their independence, they replaced that goal with the idea of republicanism. This idea stated that instead of a king, the people would rule, and the government would obtain its authority from the citizens and be responsible to them. So for the system to work, individuals would have to place the good of the country above their own interests, something that our congressman in 2014 could learn from. At first, only men were allowed to take part in governing by voting or holding public office, and not even all men. However, women could help the nation by teaching their children the virtues that benefited public life, virtues including honesty, duty, and the willingness to make sacrifices. As part of their liberty, Americans started calling for more religious freedom. Before the war, some laws discriminated against certain religions, and some states had not allowed Jews or Catholics to hold public office. After the war, states began to abolish those laws, and they also ended the practice of using tax money to support churches. Many people began to see a conflict between slavery and the ideal of liberty. Vermont outlawed slavery, and Pennsylvania passed a law to free slaves gradually. Individual African Americans also tried to end slavery. For example, Elizabeth Freeman, the lady pictured here on the right, sued for her freedom in a Massachusetts court, and she won. Her victory in 1781 and other similar cases ended slavery in all of Massachusetts. With freedom, African Americans began to form their own institutions. For example, the preacher Richard Allen helped start the Free African Society. That society encouraged African Americans to help each other. Allen also founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the first African American church in the U.S. Perhaps the main issue, though, facing Americans after the war was how to shape their national government. American anger over British taxes, violation of rights, and control of trade had caused the war. Now the United States needed a government that would protect citizens' rights and economic freedom. And in Chapter 8, we're going to take a long look at how U.S. leaders worked to create such a government.